Welcome back, AP Government. Hopefully, you're hanging in there. In this video, I want to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about who votes, because in the previous videos, we looked at different political parties and who aligns with each party. So in this one, we're going to talk about who votes and who typically doesn't vote or why they may not vote. But voting trends is a big part of this class to kind of understand analyzing data and looking at charts like the one over here. We can make a lot of interesting conclusions to say that if you're typically going to be from this category, you are largely going to be Republican or Democrat. Let me explain a little bit. We can look at how Trump's going to do really well with men voters compared to women voters. And this is going to be what's called the gender gap. The gender gap is the difference between how men and women vote. Typically, since about the 1970s, women vote a little bit more to the left and men vote a little bit more conservative. You can look at race, and the race is going to have a big impact on who you vote for. Hispanic is going to lean more left. African American is heavily going to be for the Democrat Party. White's a little bit leaning to the right with 54 to 39. Age is another factor that's really interesting. Usually the younger people vote more to the left, and the older you get, the more to the right you get. Which is an interesting factor there. You can look at white men versus white women, black men versus black women. And we can see that there's some strong alliances, if you will, with certain parties on certain groups. You can look at education as another factor. I mean, look at the non-college graduate voting for Trump. And again, as opposed to people who went to college and voting more for Clinton. Among non-whites college graduate, again, that would be Clinton, and non-college graduate, that would be for Clinton as well. So as we take a look at voting behavior in this video, I want to try to get an understanding that we look at trends, and not to say that you are beholden to this trend, right? Just because you are a white Southern male from Virginia, it doesn't mean that you're going to be a Republican, right? Just because you're an African-American female, from Virginia, doesn't mean you have to be a Democrat, because you're an individual and you can vote for whoever you want to, right? So that's a caveat I'll say up front. But that being said, we can see that there's large trends in, groups of voters and how we can kind of make some conclusions. Republicans would like to know this, and Democrats like to know this, because that would be their target audience. Okay, so here we go. Let me give you a quick question. The course wants you to be able to know the characteristics and be able to kind of identify Republican or Democrat voters. So which of the following individuals would be most likely to vote in Republican primary? Right? Take a look at your options there. A 25-year-old white male who with some high school education who is employed as a laborer in Florida. A 55-year-old African-American saleswoman from Georgia who has a master's degree. A 65-year-old Hispanic male from California who is retired and lives on Social Security. A 35-year-old female secretary from New York with an associate's degree who is a devout Catholic. Or a 45-year-old white businessman from South Carolina who attends church weekly. And even though there can be like some, characteristics that are like, well, that's kind of leaning to the right over here, the answer is going to be E. That one has all sorts of characteristics. Whether you're a white businessman from the South who attends church weekly, you're Protestant, you're going to be more inclined to vote Republican than not. How about this one? Voter turnout tends to be highest among who? Look at your options there. The answer is going to be A, college-educated voters. As a general rule, the more education you have, the more politically involved you are. And it's one of those really strong trends we can see. Education is a big factor. So we can look at education, we can look at money, okay? And then we can look at age. Usually the more you have of any of these factors, the more likely you are to vote, okay? And there's just higher trends in that way. And we can see some of the data from 2016 kind of backs that up, even though Trump definitely pulled in a lot more voters from the uneducated group, which is why 2016, I think, surprised so many, because there's a large group of people. The largest group of non-voters are white men without an education. They're the largest group that doesn't vote, and a lot of those guys turned out to vote for Trump, which made it difficult to predict who was going to win based on turnout, and they based that based on previous polls, which didn't include that group in there. Okay. All right. So as we get into it, here's John McCain's farewell statement, and I'll let you read this. But basically, John McCain, before he essentially left the Senate and then soon passed away from cancer, he's like, listen, this is a time for us to keep coming together, for us to work together If only we remember that and give each other the benefit of the presumption that we all love our country, we will get through these challenging times. We will come through them stronger than before. We always do. And I always like to kind of show you some of that civil discourse that helps to bring a little bit moderation to the political fight that we see going on in the media and going on, in candidates and elections, which is so heated, so intense, to try to tone it back a little bit and understand that, as a society, we have to work together. We have to learn how to compromise. We have to tone down that rhetoric. Otherwise, we go very, very close to having a civil war and dangerous territory there. And don't think it can't happen. Obviously, our history shows that it can. So I want to take a look at it. If you want to start your notes here, take a look at who votes with me. And then I got a fun game we'll play. Okay, you'll like it. So voting. There's factors that influencing voting. I already kind of gave you those. The factors that influence voting are going to be, like I said, age, money, and then what was the last one? Yes, education. That's right. Why is it so low in the United States? We see there's a lot of reasons why the United States might have a low voter turnout. It could just be because we typically only had one day a week. Now that's changing. You also have a two-party system. And some people just get frustrated with the fact that, you don't like the options. It's either, Trump or Biden. And people might be like, I'll sit this one out. I'm just not interested. I'm not enthusiastic about a candidate. But that's one of those things we look at. It is pretty low in the United States. We do really well if we're at 60%. In 2008, that was Barack Obama's election, 60%. Usually we're around 50%. There are predictions, though, that 2020 could possibly bring an 80% turnouts, which means all the polls that you see are just thrown out because no poll is based on that high of turnout. But who knows? This could be the year that we break, 70, 80% turnout based on your generation turning out and vote more or less than any other group. Okay? And there's all sorts of early voting and other things going on. There have been attempts to approve voter turnout. The first one's the Motor Voter Law. This passed in 1993, and this means you can register to vote at the DMV. Okay, so you're allowed, when you do all your license, there's a little place there called the Motor Voter Office, and that's where you can register to vote. In fact, back in the day, students used to have to turn in for me voter ballots, and I would take those to the DMV office and turn in for them to be registered to vote. There's a ton of this now, absentee and early voting. Even in Virginia, we started early voting where you can vote way earlier to try to accommodate large crowds and large audiences. So you don't have, that, 4 to 5 hour long waits to vote. And you think that can't happen. It has happened many times. A couple of things, voter turnout. I want you to know for voter turnout, usually there's going to be a higher turnout in a general election. Now, general election is an election that happens every 2 years. We have a national election, a general election every 2 years. Every 4 years, it's a presidential election. But remember, for the House of Representatives, they have a 2-year term. So every 2 years, we have a general election. There's usually going to be a higher turnout in the general election than in the primaries. The primaries are what we kind of came out of last year with the Republicans and Democrats. There wasn't much a fight for the Republicans because it's Trump. But the Democrats were going at it, trying to figure out, is it going to be Biden? Is it going to be Sanders? Is it going to be Warren? And ultimately, because of COVID, Sanders dropped out and it became Biden, right? There's definitely going to be a higher turnout at the national level. State and local elections usually don't even break 30%. People just don't turn out as much. And again, this is really kind of a shame because the state government has much more ability to impact your daily life than the national government does. But it doesn't get the media, it doesn't get the spotlight that a national election does. And then lastly, there's a lot more turnout for a presidential election that happens every 4 years, right? As opposed to a midterm election. A midterm election is an election that does not include the President of the United States. It happens on every 2 years or so. So we have an election in 2020. That's a presidential. The midterm election would be 2022, right? That's when the next House of Representatives election would be. 2024 would be the next presidential. 2026 would be the next midterm, okay? And that just means all of the House is up for election. And I'll put the House here. And then a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. They're kind of on a rotating schedule where they have an A, B, C schedule. So a third of them are up for election every 2 years, but never do you have all of the Senate up for election like you do in the House. That's one of the things that the Senate has. It's called a continuous body. Okay, characteristics of non-voters. Let's take a look at who typically does not vote. People who don't vote, usually your generation, somewhat my generation, even though I'm just above that category now, but usually under the age of 35, don't vote. Unmarried, they don't vote. Unskilled, and that kind of gets back to education. More live in the South, more are rural than are urban. So, this is where we get into, and more men, right? So this is your typical non-voter, was a white man from the South with very little education. Again, this group came out like never before and voted for Trump. It was a key demographic that he won over. But this is what kind of changed so much of our course. In 2016, much of what we teach is now kind of obsolete. So typically we can still say that like education and voting is pretty low. Like if you have low education, you're probably not going to vote as much. And so there's some other factors that carry over, but some of these others are really going to be questioned as we look at going forward. I make a joke here because I'm a Redskins fan, but typical non-voters as a white man from the South who's uneducated, unskilled, and I show you a picture of Tony Romo. Just joking with you there, because he is pretty talented. Maybe not in football, but other ways. All right, so here's a picture. Voter or not voter? And hopefully you would say voter, right? They're married. Good. Voter or not voter? Ooh, it's tough to tell. Who knows? But we'll probably say voter. He looks kind of educated. He looks pretty well put together. Voter or not voter? Yes, I would say voter as well. She is definitely a professional. She's got her little pin pouch going on there. That's pretty cool. And she is, working. So we'll say voter. Ooh, voter or not voter? Well, typically we would probably say non-voter, right? This is, one country music person I looked up. But usually the white men from the South are the non-voters. Again, that's what changed in 2020. Voter or not voter? Well, historically, this would be a non-voter, right? A college student, although that's changing. And now we see that's a new demographic that's really kind of growing in numbers, especially in 2020. This could be a key demographic for either candidate. Probably going to help Biden more so than Trump, just based on age and where we see typically people under the age of like 25 vote more to the left. But that's a key demographic that we'll see. They just haven't been as reliable to turn out, but maybe that's changing. And then voter or not voter. Yes, absolutely. That's Ethel, man. She not only votes, she works at the polling place. And this is really important because as we get into the election season, there's a big call for you all to help out with elections and to help out, maybe volunteer, serve as election day pages. So more information on that. But sadly, because most people that typically work on election day are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and that's a very vulnerable group for COVID, a lot of them are sitting out, and the state's in a high need for people to come out and help out with elections. So I will give you more information on that, but yes, she is definitely a voter, okay? So we'll end off here with a quick question. Identify the effect of one of the following amendments on the electorate. So you would have to be able to tell me the 15th Amendment is going to allow all men to be able to right to vote, all right? What did the 19th Amendment allow for? That would be all women, right? And then the 26th Amendment, this is the one that we can talk about looking at the changing with suffrage. This allows 18-year-olds to vote. Okay. Explain how each of the following factors may affect voter turnout. Motor voter laws are supposed to increase turnout and that you get the ability to register to vote at the DMV. Photo ID laws actually decrease turnout. If a state's going to have a photo ID law put in place, sometimes that can deter people who don't have a state-issued photo ID, whether it's a driver's license or just an ID. Select one of the following demographics and describe its relationship to the likelihood of a person voting. Again, education and age. The more you have of it, the more likely you are to vote, right? And then just explain why turnout's different in each of the following. And you would just have to know presidential versus midterm. Usually presidential is going to have more. It gets more press, right? The midterm election, there's no person at the top of the ticket. And I put no 2 on there for, but every 2 years there's a midterm election, right? And then primary versus general election. Typically general elections get more turnout because it's the one that you're actually voting against the red person versus the blue person, as opposed to the primary, which is like which red person, which blue person. Usually the extremes vote in the primaries. People like your AP government teachers will vote in the primaries, but the general election gets a much broader group of turnout. Okay. All right, guys, there's my quick overview on who votes and who doesn't vote. I hope that was helpful. I've got one more video to show you for Unit 2, and that's going to talk about polling and polling data. We'll talk to you guys soon. See ya. Bye.